Greetings, friends and brethren. This is Dr. Bob Thiel, the Continuing Church of God. Today I'd like to talk a little bit about Protestant history, Baptist history, and Church of God history. Now, I realize that history isn't necessarily a lot of people's favorite subject, but I think you'll be shocked or at least surprised by some of the things we're going to bring up, as well as if you think about some of the ramifications of this are. Now, what this is a lot of what I'm going to go over is actually part of a new book we have, Hope of Salvation, How the Continuing Church of God Differs from Protestantism. And so, the book is available online at the CCOG.org website. We've got a lot of stuff I want to go through, and I want to start off with just a general question. How firm is your foundation? Is your faith built upon a rock or sand? Jesus asked that question in Matthew 7, verses 24 to 27. Could Protestantism possibly represent the original Christian faith? Now, I won't answer every question about that in this particular sermon, but in time we plan on going through a variety of doctrines which I think will make it clearer. Or is the faith once for all delivered to the saints, which Jude wrote, Jude 3, best represented by a church like the Continuing Church of God? Now, the Continuing Church of God explicitly teaches that we are not Protestant. Now, many people have wondered about the doctrinal differences between the Continuing Church of God and Protestants, or people who are known as Protestants. In some ways, some of the differences are easy. The Continuing Church of God is a published statement of beliefs. You can go to the CCOG.org website, you can find it, it's there. But when it goes to the Protestants, though, it's a bit more difficult because of the nature of Protestantism. It gets complicated because Protestants have a variety of official beliefs, and as well as different views of history, which I'll go into a couple of those today. Anyway, part of the issue is because to try to do this is Protestantism is basically an amalgamation of many groups and denominations in the 21st century. For the purposes of this sermon, as well as in the book that I've held up, groups that claim to develop from the Protestant reformers in the 16th century, and or those who claim that those reformers were true and faithful Christians, are basically considered to be Protestant. The title Protestant, therefore, also includes most Baptists, which sometimes state they're not Protestant. We'll get more into Baptists a little bit later, but because they tend to hold doctrines like the Protestants, as well as groups like the American Evangelicals, including the Pentecostals. But when I use the term Protestant, I'm not referring to Roman or Eastern Orthodox Catholics or genuine Church of God groups. Now, the Continuing Church of God, Protestant faiths claim that their doctrines and teachings are coming from the Bible, but they disagree on a lot of points. And could these disagreements matter to you? Might they matter to God? If you look at doctrines in a historical perspective, can you handle seeing changes that you might not be comfortable with? In 1 Thessalonians 5, verse 21, I'm going to read this from the Old King James, Protestant translation. It says, "Prove all things, hold fast which is good." Can you do that? Can you hold fast to the original doctrines and practices of the Christian church? Are you willing to be like the Bereans of old, who when they heard teachings they hadn't expected, and I'm going to quote Acts 17, verse 11, they received the word with all readiness and searched the scriptures daily to find out whether these things were so. So it wasn't some just instant thing. They actually spent some time to try to go through it. And for some of these points, it would be very good for many of you to do that as well. If you can do this, I think we've got a lot of information that will be very helpful or useful. Now, let's go to the official start, if we can use that, of Protestantism. Basically, Protestants tend to consider that there's a story of a Catholic priest and monk by the name of Martin Luther. And he had some issues with the Church of Rome. So he nailed, according to the story, something called 95 Theses on the door of a Wittenberg church on October 31st, 1517. And some people call that the official start of the Protestant movement. Now, his paper called for Rome to fix 95 problems he felt it had. But these problems including things such as having priests being involved in penance and confession, objections to the usefulness of buying or selling indulgences, the lack of the need for the papal office to be involved in many private matters, and like shouldn't be between you and God and that type of thing. And he also had concerns about the church, what the Church of Rome actually did with the monies it gained from selling indulgences and other things. And when he did this initially, Martin Luther was not out to start a new church or movement. He hoped that the Church of Rome would make changes to practices that he rightly found to be objectionable. And I'll say rightly found, particularly if you're a Roman Catholic, because in time the Church of Rome has agreed with the Lutheran positions on most all of these things. However, after politics got involved, Martin Luther's teachings sparked violence and revolt, and ultimately a religion that separated from the Roman Catholic Church. And yes, they've had some discussions about getting back together, and I plan on covering that in more depth in another sermon. Now, Martin Luther was able to quickly gain a large following among many of the German nobles. Let me read something that many of you are unaware, may be unaware of, something he cried out. Now, this is from the Treatise of 1520. Here's what Martin Luther said to get his following. He said, let's just leave the Bible and do what it says, and that would be good for us. Well, he may have said that, but not here. Here's what he said. Poor Germans that we are, we have been deceived. Okay. We were born to be masters, and we've been compelled to bow beneath the yoke of our tyrants and to become slaves. Force, power, right, liberty, all these have gone over to the popes who have robbed us of them. It's time the glorious Teutonic people should cease to be the puppet of the Roman pontiff. So Martin Luther made what you could call an ethnic appeal to get the Germans to support his movement against the Church of Rome. Now, what about the term Protestant? Technically, the term Protestant came about from something happened in 1529. There were certain leaders that were opposed to an edict of the Diet of Speyer. Now, the Diet was a council, so the Council of Speyer. And this edict was intended by Charles V, who was the emperor of the so-called Holy Roman Empire, to restore religious unity, because he was on the Catholic side, if you will, Roman Catholic side. And the opposers of his edict were the first ones known to be Protestants, because they protested against his edict, because they didn't feel that they should get back together. Now, people such as Martin Luther and others such as John Calvin, Herdreich Zwingli are considered to be leaders of the Protestant Reformation in the 16th century. Now, various churches like the Anglicans, the Lutherans, the Episcopalians, the Presbyterians, and the Methodists came from the Reformers, or groups that later came from the early Reformer groups. Now, some Protestants, however, prefer to credit the start of their Reformation to earlier Reformers, such as Arnold of Brescia, John Hus, Thomas Stitneho, or John Wycliffe, who, although he translated the Bible, he claimed to be a disciple of the Roman Catholic supporting Augustine or Augustine, and another person by the name of Girolamo Savonarola. Now, non-Catholics who claim to be Christian, who consider any of those leaders I just mentioned to be true faithful Christians, are considered Protestants from our perspective here. But what about the Baptists? Does their history actually start earlier than the Protestant movement? And I was talking to actually a former Baptist who became Roman Catholic around 20 years ago. And he told me that they had this story about some thin red line and blah, 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 blah. But he looked into it and he didn't believe it, and that's one of the reasons he became Roman Catholic. Various Baptist historians have written from a perspective that the Baptists have existed independently from Roman Catholicism, and therefore they started prior to the Reformation from the Protestants. So some of the Baptists have a perpetuity, sometimes called successionist view, which is the claim that Baptists existed since the 2nd century of the book of Acts, or even before, and I'll get to that in a little bit. Now, the Perpetuity View is often identified with something called the Trail of Blood. It's a booklet that has 5 lectures by Dr. James Milton Carroll, and it was published in 1931. The booklet claims perpetuity, but I read it, and there's really no details in it, I think, that all prove his point, that it existed from the time of Jesus. It mostly points to the fact that infant baptism didn't become an issue until after the rise of Emperor Constantine, and that there were persecutions for those who disagreed with it. Well, I'll agree that infant baptism wasn't an original practice, but we'll get more about whether the Baptists themselves are that. But anyway, despite there's lack of proof of the perpetuity doctrine, a lot of Baptists believe it. Now, I'd like to read something from this Trail of Blood booklet. It says, in the first 2 centuries, this is at the start of the church, the individual churches grew rapidly and multiplied. Some of the earlier ones, such as Jerusalem, Antioch, Ephesus, Corinth, etc., grew. But then it says, serious error began creeping in. The loyal churches declared non-fellowships for those churches which accepted and practiced errors. Well, interestingly, while the Ephesus and Antioch churches remained faithful until sometime into the 3rd century, and actually there were leaders from Antioch and the Ephesus, Asia Minor area that were refuting errors and changes. Jerusalem and Corinth had apostatized by the end of the 2nd century. So suggesting perhaps that they were faithful for the first 2 centuries, that's simply not historically accurate. Further, it should be pointed out that in the Trail of Blood, the loyal churches that he claims to become separate from Rome, not all of them were actually loyal churches. The truly loyal ones never actually became part of the Greco-Roman Confederacy. Now I want to read another Baptist claim. This is from a Baptist called the Baptist History Notebook, 3rd edition. It was put out by the Baptist Training Center in 2017, and the author is B. Hissel. Here's what it claims. Novations were Baptists. Now I'll get more into novations and stuff, and I realize some of these terms are not super familiar with most of us. They continued on as Anabaptists. So they say that they started as Novations and they became Anabaptists, so I'll get to that. Hassel lists them right along with other Baptists of the other ages. Among the persecuted people of God, there have been Novations, Donatus, Cathari, Paterines, Paulicians, Petrobrusians, Henricans, Arnoldus, Albigenses, Waldenses, Lollards, Mennonites, and Baptists, nearly all of whom were occasionally designated Anabaptists or rebaptizers by their enemies because they disregarded infant or unregenerate baptism and baptized all adults, whether previously baptized or not, who upon credible profession of faith applied them for membership in their churches, thus insisting upon a spiritual or regenerate church membership, the first and most important mark of the Apostolic Church. Now I agree that having real baptism is an important mark of the early Apostolic Church. I don't disagree with that. But, while some of the groups that he mentioned held some Baptist doctrines, many did not. For example, the Cathari, who he mentioned, considered the cross to be the mark of the beast, yet modern Baptists use crosses as a religious symbol. For another example, he mentioned the Waldenses. Well, the Waldenses paid multiple tithes, many of them kept the 7th-day Sabbath. They wouldn't keep Easter, by the way, and they certainly were not like modern Baptists. Now, I'd like to read an assessment from a Baptist pastor by the name of Tyler Robbins, what he says about these Baptists claiming that the Novations were Baptists. He writes, "Were the Novations Baptists?" And we'll get more into Novations a little bit later, but let me read what this particular Baptist writes here. "Many Baptists like to claim the Novations as their own. If the Novations cannot be claimed as direct descendants, can they be claimed as a distant spiritual kin of the modern-day Baptist? Some Baptists would agree. Much of what's been written of the Novations of any stripe is at best a gloss, and at worst, completely inaccurate. An example of the completely inaccurate, here's something from G.H. Orchard, who wrote in 1855. One Novation of a presbyter or elder in the Church of Rome, strongly opposed the readmission of apostates, but he was not successful. Novatian, with every considerate person, was disgusted with the hasty admission of such apostates into communion, with the conduct of many pastors. Okay, so he's saying that this guy is wrong, that these people were not it. Now, he also, this pastor continues, J.M. Carroll in his infamous treatise Trail of Blood declared that when errors of the compromised local church came in, infant baptism regeneration crept into the churches, the Novatians sallied forth for the cause of ecclesiastical purity. Again, I'm reading from this Baptist pastor who's now quoting the Trail of Blood here. Some of the churches rigorously refuted them, so much so that in 251 A.D., the loyal churches declared non-fellowship of those churches which accepted and practiced these errors. And thus came about the first official separation among the churches. Well, let me just skip back on here. I'm going to say something that I wasn't going to mention. Actually, it was clear by the end of the 2nd century that the churches of Antioch and Asia Minor were separated from the churches of Rome and Alexandria over the issue of the date of Passover. This is way before then. That was a clear separation in the 2nd century. But the Baptists are going into the 3rd century when Rome had already compromised on many points. Anyway, getting back to what this Baptist pastor, Tyler Robbins, writes about this, he then says, Jack Hode, a solid historian, likewise missed the boat when he wrote the Novatians were making a strong protest against the same moral laxity and weak, almost non-existent disciplinary standard of the churches. And then he writes, Thomas Armitage observed that the Novatians demanded pure churches which enforced strict discipline, and so they were called Puritans. According to this Baptist pastor, all these brief characterizations are wrong. Then he mentions that Dionysius claimed that Novatians actually plied gullible men with liberal amounts of alcohol and compelled them to support his rival claim to the bishopric. So in other words, he's saying, no, these are not pure, great people that were supporting Novatian. Furthermore, Tyler Robbins writes, Novatian himself was baptized by pouring, not immersion. His baptism wasn't done as a public testimony. It was done in private on his sickbed. And so he says, he was not a Baptist crusader. So you shouldn't say Novatian was Baptist. Perhaps I should mention that Novatian was not a faithful Christian. And actually, he's considered to be the second antipope by the Church of Rome. And that church claims that Novatian declared himself Bishop of Rome or Pope in 251 A.D. His faith did not hold to many of the original Christian churches, Christian church teachings, but the Trail of Blood points to his 251 AD declaration to support a false Baptist claim of perpetuity. Now, as far as perpetuity goes, I should also mention that Dr. Carroll's book actually says Baptists don't believe in apostolic succession. Well, it's true that the groups that call themselves Baptists don't have true apostolic succession. But since they don't, obviously they shouldn't claim perpetuity. Now I'd like to go and read some other improper claims of succession perpetuity by Baptist minister G.H. Orchard, which Tyler Robbins had mentioned as well. And here's something from his writing. This is from 1838. It's called A Concise History of Foreign Baptists. This is from page V, so the introduction page. One of the introductory pages. The Baptists may be considered as the only Christian community which has stood since the time of the apostles. Now people hear that and some people want to believe it. But let's go through this one more step. He continues, all Christian communities during the first 3 centuries were of the Baptist denomination. No, they weren't. The Oriental Baptist churches, that means the churches in Asia Minor, with their successors as the Paulicians, so he's claiming the Paulicians, continued in their purity until the 10th century when these people visited France, where they flourished under the Crusader army until the Crusader army scattered and drew blood against the offenders. There's a lot of issues with this guy's assertions. The historical reality is that while all the faithful churches believed in baptism by immersion for the repentance, that's true, the so-called Oriental churches, again meaning those in Asia Minor, held many doctrines that many modern Baptists oppose. Their successors, he claims, were the Paulicians. They were Binitarian. And by the way, I'm not going to give you all the references that prove all of this, but they are in the book that I held up before, The Hope of Salvation, How the Continuing Church of God Differs from Most Protestants. I have, for example, citations that you can look up to verify that what I'm saying is true. Now, the reason I'm bringing this out is what many people do, including the Baptists. They go out and they brandish apart names and just make assertions without proof. But I'm willing to tell you, or I'm telling you here, that we have actual documented proof that what I'm saying is correct. The Paulicians were not modern Baptists. They were Binitarian. Modern Baptists are Trinitarian. The Paulicians, by the way, according to historical records, they kept Passover on the 14th. And the Church of Rome had switched to Sunday by the early to mid 2nd century. Not to like 250 would be the 3rd century. And the Paulicians were just still doing that. The Baptists don't do that. Novation didn't do that. The Paulicians also kept the seventh-day Sabbath while opposing Sunday. You don't have too many Baptists to do that. Even the Seventh-day Baptists aren't that much opposition. Okay. Also, the Paulicians did not keep Christmas, but modern Baptists do. And the faithful ones that were called Paulicians were pacifists. And that's simply not the case for the modern Baptists. They're not that way. And while we in the Continuing Church of God would agree that the doctrines I just mentioned a moment ago are original doctrines, modern Baptists would not agree. They don't hold them. Now I'm going to go into some more details. In his book, Baptist minister G.H. Orchard also claimed that primitive Baptists essentially began with John the Baptist. I'm going to get to him a little bit later. Then he includes as primitive Baptist Ignatius of Antioch, who was a Church of God leader, Polycarp of Smyrna, who was a Church of God leader, Justin Martyr, who taught a doctrine that's opposed to modern Baptists, Irenaeus of Lyon, Clement of Alexandria, Theophilus of Antioch, who was a Church of God leader. And by the way, we have a sermon on Theophilus of Antioch at the Continuing COG channel. We also have one on Polycarp of Smyrna. Baptist minister G.H. Orchard also considered the writings of John Chrysostom and Augustine of Hippo as, quote, testimonies of the fathers, and he called them great men. The problem is, not all of any of those so-called primitive Baptists that G.H. Orchard claimed to be Baptists actually held many Baptist doctrine. But when people hear those names, they don't know who these people are. So they just assume that he wrote it. He must know what he was talking about. The problem is very few people know much about the history of the church. And I'm going to hold up another booklet called The Continuing History of the Church of God. This and the one on Protestantism that I held up, this is available at the CCOG.org website, www.ccog.org. Go under the Literature tab under Books and Booklets, and you can find these, and these are free. Read them online. There's no cost, no obligation. We're not asking you for your email address. But since people don't know who Ignatius is versus Polycarp versus Justin Martyr or Irenaeus, they don't know. But you can know. If you're willing to be like the Bereans and search the scriptures and sometimes historical records to see if these things are so, you can prove whether or not what I'm telling you is true. And by the way, this particular book has hundreds of references beyond hundreds of scriptures. There's close to there's over 300 secular references in here to demonstrate when we make claims or assertions about church history, we can back it up. The Baptists cannot do that. You try to do it by listing these people's names, but this is simply not the case. Now, as far as John the Baptist, if you want to, I'm going to go to the book of Luke. I'll go to Luke 1, verse 79. It's something John the Baptist was prophesied to do. Luke 1, verse 79. This will be from the New King James Version of the Bible I'm going to read from. John the Baptist was prophesied, quote, to give light to those who sit in darkness, in the shadow of death, to guide our feet into the way of peace. So John the Baptist was supposed to help guide our way into the way of peace. So let's go, if you're in Luke, let's go to Luke chapter 3. Just going to read one verse. Luke 3, verse 14. Likewise, the soldiers asked him meaning John, being John the Baptist, what shall we do? And so that's John the Baptist, said to them, do not intimidate anyone or accuse falsely, and be content with their wages. Now the word here, intimidate, is from the Greek word diaseo, which the King James Version translates as violence. Strong's translates it to mean shake thoroughly, to intimidate, to do violence to. It comes from two Greek words, diagnosis, which would be the word diagnosis, and seio. Diagnosis is translated as examination, and seio as to rock somebody, to agitate them, to throw into tremor. Now there's no way that a soldier cannot agitate or intimidate if they're trying to kill somebody. Thus, John the Baptist's statements here show that military violence was not for the future followers of God. Early professors of Christ, whether or not they were in the Church of God or essentially, let's say, the Greco-Roman churches, understood that. Yet, sadly, most people who profess Christ today don't feel that way, including many modern Baptists. That's one of the many ways that modern Baptists don't follow the teachings or practices of John the Baptist. By the way, some of the other leaders that G.H. Orchard referred to in his book certainly are not Christian. One, Justin Martyr, for example, he reported he didn't live any different than anybody else. And the Apostle Paul said Christians should live differently. And then two people that he called great men, John Chrysostom and Augustine, not only weren't they real Christians, they actually taught infant baptism. And as far as Justin Martyr goes, by the way, he said, if you believe that when somebody dies, their soul goes to heaven, he says, you're not a Christian. But they're claiming this guy was a true Baptist. There's simply no historical perpetuity for what are now the bulk of Baptists, yet it's still asserted at times. I want to read something from a false claim from the 20th century, from an article by a Baptist by the name of B.M. Cedarholm. Historians testify that local churches, which hold the doctrines, beliefs, and practices of today's Bible-believing separatist Baptists, have had continuous existence since the days of Christ. This cannot be said of any other church or churches or religious organization. As far back as 100 A.D., without doubt, there were Baptists. The churches were Baptists then, as all Christians were then Baptists. Now those are merely claims. We in the Continuing Church of God can demonstrate, yes, our beliefs were held back 100 AD, and since then throughout history. The Baptists cannot do that, despite the fact that they claim it. Now if you were to read the entire article that this Baptist Cedarholm wrote, you'd see what his proofs are. Basically he quotes people who have a Baptist orientation from a century or two or three ago, and they just say this. They don't prove it, they just make the assertion. So he quotes some writings. Baptists had this existence. Nobody else had this existence. He quotes some writings, but he doesn't actually go and prove it. He doesn't look at other groups, and he doesn't identify the groups that had it, because then they find out they certainly didn't do it. Now, because King Henry VIII and the early Lutherans condemned the Anabaptists in the 16th century, Baptists have not always embraced the title Protestant. Yet, modern Baptists agree more with the Protestants than the Anabaptists of old on some teachings and practices. Now, let me give you a couple of examples. Here's something that the Anabaptists were condemned by the Lutherans. This is Article 17, called Of Christ's Return to Judgment, from the Augsburg Confession that the Lutherans did back in 1530. They call it the Diet of Augsburg, or the Council of Augsburg. This is their condemnation. Also, they teach that at the consummation of the world, Christ will appear for judgment and will raise up the dead. He will give the godly and elect eternal life and everlasting joys, but ungodly men and devils he will condemn to be tormented without end. Because this is the position that the Lutherans, one of the positions that we're talking about. They condemn the Anabaptists who think there'll be an end of punishment of condemned men and devils. That's known as the doctrine of annihilation. So the Anabaptists were condemned for teaching annihilation. In the Continuing Church of God, we teach annihilation. As a matter of fact, a book I'll probably hold up another time or so, Universal Offer of Salvation. We go into that in great depth and proof that this is a true biblical position. But modern Baptists don't believe in annihilation. Okay. They condemn also others who are now spreading certain Jewish opinions that before the resurrection of the dead, the godly will take possession of the kingdom of the world and the ungodly everywhere suppressed. Well, this is talking about a millennial doctrine, which we in the Continuing Church of God hold. Some Baptists do hold that particular view. But let me read something else about this, that the Anabaptists were condemned by the Lutherans for. This is Article 16 of Civil Affairs. It says, of civil affairs, they, the Lutherans, teach that lawful civil ordinance are good works of God, and that it's right for Christians to bear civil office, to sit as judges, to judge matters by the imperial and other existing laws, to award just punishments, to engage in just wars, to serve as soldiers, to make legal contracts, to hold marriage, to make oath when required by the magistrates, to marry a wife, to be given in marriage. They condemn the Anabaptists who forbid these civil offices to Christians. So the Anabaptists were condemned because they didn't believe that they should be able to be soldiers and fighting in wars, that they should swear oaths, and that they should be political people, elected office and that type of thing. In general, modern Protestants encourage military service, voting, jury duty, other aspects of worldly politics, where we in the Continuing Church of God do not. We are separate from that. We also don't believe in swearing oaths. Now, modern Baptists generally agree with the Protestants on these points. And for example, in the 20th century, the Baptist by the name of Jimmy Carter became President of the United States. And so that's different from, again, what a lot of people claim as far as our Anabaptist ancestors go. The Baptists who claim these Anabaptists were their people are wrong because they don't have the same teachings. Now, I'd like to read an admission from a Protestant scholar. This will be from a Greek scholar and evangelical Baptist, Dr. Daniel Wallace. He wrote, quote, evangelical defenses of various doctrines occasionally are poorly founded. We sometimes claim things to be true because we want them to be true. See, Baptists want some of this stuff to be true, but it's not. Without doing the exhaustive spade work needed to support our conclusions. So yes, if you want to find out the truth about church history, yes, you've got to do a lot of detailed work. Now, we've done a lot of it for you in this particular booklet, The Continuing History of the Church of God. But people just want things to be true that's simply not true. People don't want to be shaken up from where they're at. They're content where they're at. You know, Jesus warned about somebody who got a talent and he buried it and didn't do anything with it because he's afraid to do something. Hopefully you're not afraid to look at the church history. You're not afraid to figure out where the true Christian church is today. You're not afraid to see whether or not Protestant faith or the Continuing Church of God are the most faithful. In terms of church history, the reality is simply the Baptists don't have it the way that they claim to have it. They claim the Anabaptists. Now, some of the Anabaptists were Church of God people, others were not. We don't claim all the Anabaptists. But again, if you see what the Lutherans condemned them for, that helps explain why some Baptists say, well, we weren't Protestant, we were condemned by the Protestants. Yeah, but you hold the same views that the Protestants often hold. So that's a big problem. So you would think with all the facts, people wouldn't keep pushing this. Well, today on the internet you can find stuff. Baptist ministers who assert that their modern religion has true perpetuity. And I want to read something that I found. I found this on the 20th of January, or this is where I looked at it, 2020. Calvary Baptist Church believes the Lord started the first church. True. During his earthly ministry. They said, we don't believe the church started on the day of Pentecost, but at least 3 years earlier. And John the Baptist baptized Jesus, basically. We further believe that Jesus promised his church a continued existence, perpetuity. That's true. Jesus did promise his church perpetuity, but the Baptists aren't that church. And you can prove that if you're willing to look at the Bible and willing to look at church history records that are out there. This article continues. Baptist churches have existed from the time of Christ to the present day. Those churches have borne many names in many places. One such name was Anabaptist. Well, I just read you what the Anabaptists were condemned for. Those are not the beliefs that most of these Baptist churches today hold. Here's another claim from this Calvary Independent Baptist Church. The pastor's name is Oldfeld. He writes, some of God's people were known as Novations. In about the year 250, 100 years after Montanus, there was a man in Rome who was converted to Christ while on his deathbed. He had been a well-known and distinguished pagan philosopher. Novatian was one of the several elders of the church at Rome before the formation of Roman Catholicism. In the article is called Some of God's People Were Known as Novations. No, they were not. And I've explained even some Baptists have gone through this and say, absolutely not, that is simply not the case. And I should point out, by 250 AD, I mentioned before, the Church of Rome had changed many doctrines and was already aligned with apostates such as those in Alexandria, Jerusalem. And by 250, Antioch had apostatized. And leaders of the Oriental churches, such as Polycarp, Polycrates, chastened or complained against these Roman leaders in the 2nd century. And 250 is the 3rd century, by the way. Furthermore, by including the Roman Novations, the Baptists have proven by their perpetuity declaration that they don't have true perpetuity. Now, instead of claiming doctrinal perpetuity from the original New Testament church, what did the late Baptist minister and civil rights leader Martin Luther King conclude about his religion? You might find this interesting. Here's something that he wrote when he was doing early theological research back in 1949 and 1950. So I'm reading from Dr. Martin Luther King. When Mithraism is compared to Christianity, there are surprisingly many points of similarity. Of all the mystery cults, Mithraism was the greatest competitor of Christianity. That Christians did copy and borrow from Mithraism cannot be denied. So a Baptist minister, Martin Luther King, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., said that his version of Christianity was combined with Mithraism. He wrote, Mithraism was suppressed by the Christians sometime in the latter part of the 4th century AD. But its collapse seemed to be due to the fact that by that time, many of its doctrines had been adopted by the church, so it was practically absorbed by its rival. So what Martin Luther is saying, that, they finally did away with Mithraism at the end of the 4th century, because by that time, the Greco-Roman churches had adopted Mithraism. And many aspects of Mithraism are currently held by Baptists and most Protestants. And these were not the original beliefs. And Martin Luther recognized this. Let me continue what else Martin Luther wrote. The church made a sacred day out of Sunday partially because of the resurrection. But when we observe a little further, Martin Luther writes, Martin Luther King Jr., that is, we find that a solar festival, Sunday, was a sacred day of Mithra. It's also interesting that since Mithra was addressed as Lord, Sunday must have been the Lord's day, long before Christian use. Interesting. It's also to be noticed that our Christmas, December 25th, was the birthday of Mithra, and was only taken over in the 4th century as a date actually unknown as the birth of Jesus. Well, actually it was done because Emperor Constantine had been celebrating the birth of Mithra on December 25th and thought this would be a good day to celebrate Jesus' birth. Martin Luther King Jr. writes, to make the picture a little more clear, we may list a few similarities between these two religions. One, both regard Sunday as a holy day. This is Mithraism, the pagan religion, and the Protestant Baptists. 2, December 25th came to be considered as the anniversary of the birth of Mithra and Christ also. And 3, baptism and a ritual meal were important parts of both groups. In summary, we can say that the belief in immortality, which Justin Martyr and actually plus Church of God leaders condemned, a mediator between God and man, the observance of certain sacramental rites, were common to Mithraism and Christianity. Well, actually, not to original Christianity, but as Dr. King pointed out, this ended up getting absorbed in the 4th century. He meaning Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., clearly understood that the Protestant and Catholic religions, and including the Baptists, were basically, they changed by Mithraism. Okay. Now, it's a documented fact that modern Baptists adopted beliefs that the early Oriental churches and their faithful successor did not hold to. Now, what are some of the ramifications that Baptists actually did have their doctrinal continuity? What if they really did? Well, first of all, that would be much less than 1% of the world's population during the church age, if we count from, let's say, Acts 2 to present. Baptists, they don't teach that God's going to offer salvation to all either in this age or the age to come, where early Christians did, and that can be demonstrated in our book here, Universal Offer of Salvation. Well, we talk about this a little bit in the Protestant book. We go in a lot more depth and a lot more scriptures here. There's hundreds of scriptures here, which will show this. So either the Baptists are teaching that well over 99% of the population are going to be permanently lost, because they weren't their kind of Baptists. That's a fact. Or if non-Baptists are to be saved, their perpetuity teaching basically means it doesn't matter if one's a Baptist to be saved. Now, I think, based on comments from various Baptists, including those from the late Billy Graham, Baptists believe that you don't have to be a Baptist to be saved. As a matter of fact, Billy Graham, when he originally started out, he was anti-Catholic. But then he started teaching in some of the Catholic countries, and his campaigns, the people who supposedly gave their heart to the Lord or were saved or whatever it is they did, were referred to Roman Catholic priests a lot of the times. And so it doesn't seem to matter if you're Baptist or not, according to most Baptists. And that makes them Baptists really much like evangelical Protestants, who also hold the position that most people who ever lived aren't going to be saved. Practically speaking, Baptists tend to hold essentially Protestant views, generally in line with evangelicals. Okay. Now, within the Protestant world, there's actually two main views of apostolic succession. So I'll move away from the Baptists a little bit here. One that's actually held by the Baptist evangelicals, there's no such thing. Well, they want to say there's no such thing because they can't find their religion in early days. The other view is that supposedly the Protestants have direct apostolic succession. And so I went and I found a view that was published in 1883 by Angelo Benton about his view, how come the Church of England has apostolic succession. And he claims it from a bunch of different sources, by the way. He says the succession of the English churches from St. Polycarp, and he also mentions St. John is given here, St. Peter, St. John, St. Paul. And he says the English episcopate has probably twined into one cord with more than one succession. So he's saying basically he has succession from various places, and that's how come the Church of England has true apostolic succession. So first of all, he starts out with Ephesus. And he says that talks about St. John, and then he was succeeded by Polycarp of Smyrna. And yes, he was succeeded by Polycarp of Smyrna. As a matter of fact, in a particular book I pulled up several times, if you see this, about the hope of salvation, we actually have a statue here, a rendering of a statue, supposedly of Polycarp. They don't know what he looks like, and one of Martin Luther. And in this particular book that I was just holding up, available at CCOG.org, we document a lot of the beliefs that Polycarp had, and you know what? The Church of England doesn't have those. So they have a problem claiming him. And then what they say is that Polycarp from Smyrna sent out somebody named Pothinus. And he went to a place called Lyons in southern France, and he was succeeded by somebody called Irenaeus. Well, the problem was that Irenaeus was not faithful. As a matter of fact, not only was Irenaeus not faithful, according to Pope Benedict Emeritus XVI, Irenaeus was the father of Catholic theology. So if you're Protestant, you're going to include in your successing list, the Church of England, this guy did, Irenaeus, who was the father of Catholic theology. Okay? Now, there's another place they've got this other person listed. They got Jerusalem. So talking about James. Okay, that's fine. But then in their succession list, they list a guy named Marcus. Marcus was not even considered a successor by Irenaeus of Lyon, by the way. Marcus was a compromised person. He basically told people that if they wanted to live in Jerusalem, because the Jews had revolted, they couldn't live like the Jews anymore. So Christians who in Jerusalem were keeping the Sabbath, not eating unclean meats, keeping Passover on the 14th, for example, were basically told, if you want to live in Jerusalem, because the Jews revolted, Emperor Hadrian says you got to change. You got to eat unclean meat, you got to go to church on Sunday, and keep Passover on the 14th. Marcus was one who advocated that, and he's in the succession list that the Church of England has, but not in the Church of God. Interestingly, and this is one problem Protestantism has in general, they list Rome here, and they list St. Peter and St. Paul as the founders of the Church of Rome. Yet, according to various Catholic scholars, St. Peter and St. Paul did not found the Church of Rome. It was founded before them. Then they list people like Sextus and Anicetus as faithful. Well, Polycarp of Smyrna went to Rome, and he blasted Anicetus. But this is in this particular succession list. Then you've got people such as Victor, and he was blasted by Polycrates of Ephesus. Polycarp and Polycrates were Church of God leaders. So if you think your church hasn't changed, they're accepting people who were bad as far as the Church of God was concerned. Furthermore, you had Zephyrinus and Calixtus, this guy lists in the succession list. Those people were corrupt. According to a Catholic saint, Zephyrinus actually took bribes, and that's how Calixtus ended up becoming his successor, Bishop of Rome. Calixtus also, by the way, was in favor of abortion and did other bad things. And again, he's in the succession list of the Church of England. And then they also have the fact that the Catholics had a guy by the name of Augustine go there, but Augustine was not a true Christian either. What's interesting to me is that Protestant scholars will acknowledge that Polycarp conversed with the apostles, yet they don't believe what he says. There's various Anglicans and Episcopalians who claim succession through the Apostle John through the bishops of Asia Minor, but they don't hold those beliefs either. And perhaps we should talk a little bit about the founding of the official Church of Rome. Church of England. So I told you there's some people who claim that there's 3 or 4 ways or 5 ways that they had apostolic succession, and I just went through why none of those ways were valid for them. But it turns out the official Church of England wasn't truly formed for reasons that square with Scripture. In 1534, it was really formed because King Henry VIII was denied permission to marry, to annul his marriage actually with Catherine of Aragon by Pope Clement VII, because he wanted to marry Anne Boleyn. Adultery, not theological doctrines, were his motivation. So that's what happened, and the same thing, something was going on the continent with Martin Luther and company, so he thought he could get away with this. Anyway, after a time, Anne Boleyn miscarried, so then what did Henry VIII have done with her? He had her beheaded. Then he married Jane Seymour. Okay, King Henry VIII was not interested in practicing original Christianity. And let me also say, in the 21st century, even those who don't accept many original Christian church doctrines should be able to discount any apostolic succession for the Church of England. Not only because of Henry VIII, but because of its beliefs its current bishops hold, particularly in regards to sexual morality, which are in clear conflict with passages in the New Testament such as Romans 1, verses 18 to 32. Now, was there any perpetuity for anybody or succession? Well, by the time of Tertullian of Alexandria, around 195 AD, he concluded there were only 2 basically apostolic churches, and the rest were other people were heretics. So let me read what he wrote, and this is going to be from the Catholic Encyclopedia version of his prescription against heretics. Tertullian wrote, "Anyway, the heresies are at best novelties, they're new, and have no continuity with the teaching of Christ. Perhaps some heretics may claim apostolic antiquity. We reply, let them publish the origins of their churches and unroll their catalog of bishops from now till now from the apostles, or for some bishop appointed by the apostles. Such as the Smyrnaeans count from Polycarp and John, and we in the Continuing Church of God trace our heritage from John to Polycarp, and the Romans from Clement and Peter. Let the heretics invent something to match this." Now, when Tertullian wrote this, Jerusalem and Alexandria were basically part or associated with the Church of Rome, so they were claiming some type of succession that way. Whereas Antioch was aligned with the Smyrnaeans. Tertullian must have known, or certainly should have known, that the two groups that he claimed had succession had different beliefs. And of course, at the most, only one could have had the original belief. Only one could truly be contending for the original faith. Now, what became the Roman and Greek Orthodox churches coalesced, and for centuries they remained in communion with each other. Ultimately, from the Roman portion, we sprung up the Protestant Reformers. Now, the group that Tertullian referred to as the Smyrnaeans was the Church of God. And this continued throughout the entire church age. And again, I've held up this booklet, which you can read to see whether or not what I'm saying is true. And we teach that our doctrines trace back to the New Testament, and we have succession from there through the apostles and from the faithful followers who became known as the Smyrnaeans. And therefore, even though the Continuing Church of God is not Eastern Orthodox or Roman Catholic, we're not Protestant. We preceded the start of Protestantism, and actually we existed before there actually was an organized Church of Rome. Now, when we use the term Church of God, we're not using that name for groups that don't believe they have to keep the Ten Commandments, or who are non-Sabbatarian, or are Pentecostal or Trinitarian. Most of those groups basically are Protestant. But like many Protestants, we in the Continuing Church of God consider that the Christian church started the day of Pentecost. And like some Protestants who believe in church eras, now most don't, we in the Continuing Church of God consider that we are the successors of the previous church eras, and each of these eras are talked about in this particular book. We consider ourselves to be the spiritual descendants of the Ephesus era, which lasted until about 135 AD. Revelation, in Ephesus talk about Revelation 2, 1 through 7. The Smyrnaeans, which went from about 135 to 450 AD, read about them in Revelation 2, 8 through 11. The Pergamosians, from around 450 to 1050 AD, you read about them in Revelation 2, 12 through 17. The Thyatirans, 1050 to 1600 AD, you read about them in Revelation 2, 18 through 29. The Sardisians, from 1600 to 1931 approximately, you read about them in Revelation 3, 1 through 6. The Philadelphians, Revelation 3, 7 through 13, which that era began in 1931, and most of the era ended in 1986, but we specifically believe we're the most faithful remnant of the Philadelphian church, living in the time of the Laodicean era, which we believe started around 1986. And you can read about the Laodiceans in Revelation 3, 14 through 22. And I realize that Protestants who believe in church eras have different dates. Now, as far as the name of the church goes, I'm going to read a couple of second century references to the name. Ignatius, in his letter to the Smyrnaeans, said, Church of God the Father, the church which is at Smyrna. And Polycarp, in his letter to the Philippians, said, Polycarp and the presbyters with him, to the church of God sojourning in Philippi. And by the way, there's other references from Ignatius. And after Polycarp died, the Smyrnaeans wrote, the church of God which sojourns at Smyrna, to the church of God which sojourns in Philemon. Now, the predominant biblical name of the true church in the New Testament is Church of God. And I'm going to hold this up because I'm not going to read it, but variants of the name can be found in various passages in the Bible. And this is all in the continuing history book, as well as the book I was holding up before, Hope of Salvation. Okay, how we differ from the Protestants. And I mentioned this, so you can look this up. Probably you should also mention that the first time the term Catholic Church was used in the ancient literature was actually talking about the Church of God at Smyrna. You can find that in Ignatius' letter to the Smyrnaeans. And by the way, the Roman Catholic Church agrees with it. And the second time was in a letter from the Smyrnaeans also. So one could actually say that the Smyrna Church was the Apostolic Catholic Church of God. Also, let me read something from the Ambassador College Bible Correspondence Course of 1965. It says the Paulicians claim to be the universal and apostolic church founded by Jesus Christ's apostles. Of the false churches, they would say, we do not belong to these. They long ago broke connection with the church. So the Paulicians, according to the old Radio Church of God, said we're the universal or Catholic Church, apostolic church, because we have ties to the beginning and other groups do not. The Waldensians also, by the way, claim that their community went from ancient times to present. Also, a Sardis era church leader by the name of Andrew Duggar wrote, the succession of apostolic power has come down unbroken. The Scriptures teaches most emphatically that apostolic virtue and power was handed down from the apostle to apostle by divine ordinance of the laying out of hands in prayer. He lists various Scriptures. He then says that the Sabbath-keeping Church of God has most definite link of connection back through the holy men to the days of the apostles is certain. The very same faith, practice, and divine worship has been definitely handed down to present. Now I'd like to read something from the Philadelphia era. This is from Herbert W. Armstrong, 1980, in the Worldwide Church of God. He wrote, the Worldwide Church of God is the present generation continuing the Church of God founded AD 31 by Jesus Christ. The Worldwide Church of God holds to the same faith, doctrines, and same custom and practice as the original church of AD 31 under the original apostles. Well, that church doesn't exist anymore. The apostasy hit there, and they don't even use that name anymore. But we in the continuing Church of God believe that apostolic succession continued into the 21st century, that we are the present generation continuing the Church of God founded in AD 31 by Jesus Christ. One of the reasons that's one of the reasons why we're not Protestant. Now, I'd like to read some stuff from a Protestant historian by the name of Philip Schaff. He said there were at least 72 groups that were called Cathari in the 8th through 14th century, which claimed ties to the Paulicians, which I read about before, who were Benedictarians, Sabbath keepers, pacifists. And he said that some of the doctrine they held were Church of God. The Cathari were opposed many doctrines of the established church. They were against the Greco-Roman churches. There are two churches they held, the wicked one, the righteous one. They themselves constitute the church of the righteous, outside of which there is no salvation, having received the imposition of hands and done penance according to the teaching of the apostles. Its fruits prove that the established church was not the true church. The true church endures persecution, does not prescribe it. The true church teaches first. The Roman church baptizes first. The Roman church is the woman of the apocalypse, the harlot, the pope, the antichrist. The depositions of their trials indicate that the Cathari made much use of Scripture. Yes, like in the continuing Church God, we use Scripture a lot. For example, this particular book, Hope of Salvation, is mostly Scripture. I've got another book here, if I can find it. Let's see if I can run across it. Proof Jesus is the Messiah. This is almost all the Scripture. And even the church history book, which has a lot of historical references, also has lots of Scriptures. Yes, from the Scriptures, the Cathari went to demonstrate that they were who they claimed to be. And we, the continuing Church of God, use Scriptures as well because of our beliefs. The Cathari renounced priestly vestments, altars, and crosses as idolatrous. But you have Baptists claiming these people were the same as them. The Cathari called the cross the mark of the beast and declared it had no more virtue than a ribbon for binding of hair. It was an instrument of Christ's shame and death, therefore not to be used. They also rejected as would be expected, the doctrines of purgatory and indulgences. They rejected judicial oaths and war, just like the later Anabaptists, but not the current modern Baptists. And laying on of hands of succession should be understood to mean that although there are unfaithful bishops and pastors throughout history, we consider that many of our members have unbroken, that our members and our leaders have unbroken laying on of succession, hand succession from the time of the original apostles. And as a matter of fact, one thing I personally did a decade or so ago was to see if people who came over from Europe had laying on of hands before they came over here, to be sure that it was truly unbroken succession and not just some religion that sprung up over in America or something. We, by the way, in the Continuing Church of God also have the last days signs of Acts 2:17-18. You can read about that at the CCOG.org website. And unlike the Church of Rome, by the way, we don't claim infallibility for any of our leaders or any of their writings, including mine, unless we're just quoting Scripture. Okay? And by the way, the Smyrnaeans we talked about could also be considered the Apostolic See of Ephesus. As far as succession goes, interestingly, according to a Protestant minister by the name of William Dawson, the Celtic churches of Ireland, Galloway of Ionia, were at one with the British church. These claimed, like southern Gaul and Spain, to have drawn their faith from the Apostolic See of Ephesus. Well, the Apostolic See of Ephesus kept Passover on the 14th. Polycrates of Ephesus wrote to the Bishop of Rome, Victor, 190-something AD, blasting him for wanting them to change Passover to a different date. And, by the way, the faithful in the British Isles were keeping Passover on the 14th. Furthermore, this Protestant minister says, their liturgies, or such fragments, have come down to us, bear marks of belonging to the Oriental family of liturgies. What does that mean? That means our church services, the liturgies are similar to those that were from Asia Minor. That's what they mean by the Oriental churches. Now let me say that there's documented evidence that the Celtic churches, for at least originally, they kept the seventh-day Sabbath, they kept Passover on the 14th. They also engaged in foot washing, which most Protestants and Baptists don't do. Okay. As far as succession, we do have a succession list. I'm going to hold this up, but recommend that you read this book or the book Hope of Salvation, How the Continuing Church of God Differs from Most Protestants, because these lists are in those books. But I'll hold this up for just a moment. We claim from Peter, the Apostle Peter, to John, to Polycarp, to Thracius, to Segerus, to Papirius, to Melito, to Apollinaris, to Polycrates, to Polonius, to Camarius. And now it gets a little confusing down here. Euodemus of Smyrna probably was, but he apostatized. So we think Pionius of Smyrna took over, but it was probably through Euonymium for a while. And you say, wait a second, you talk about other groups that have leaders that apostatized. How can you say they don't have succession? Because their groups continued in the apostasy, whereas people like Pionius, who succeeded Euodemus, didn't do that. Okay. I should also mention that we don't accept some later leaders in Asia Minor. There were reports that things changed over there. And you can read the books and we'll go into more details about those type of things. But what was going on, according to Church of God leaders, for example, Polycarp of Smyrna warned in the early 2nd century that there were many taking a vain form of Christianity. He called it the vanity of many. And later, Serapion of Antioch, before his death, warned about a lying confederacy that was growing. And after his death, his area got taken over by those people, basically. Eusebius of Caesarea, who was the official historian in the 4th century for Emperor Constantine, put together an apostolic succession list of the first 15 bishops of Jerusalem, and they were all bishops of the circumcision, which meant that they kept Passover on the 14th, they did not eat unclean meat, they kept the biblical holy days, etc., etc. They were not Protestant. But that changed with Marcus after the Bar Kokhba revolt. And you say, couldn't just have happened then? Well, that's true. In the 2nd century, a writer by the name of Hegesippus wrote that the corruption in Jerusalem began a couple decades before. He talked about a guy named Theophilus who had doctrines of Simon Magus, the guy who's warned about in Acts chapter 8, and Marcion of Pontus, who I'll talk about another time. But not everybody, most people wouldn't accept it, so Theophilus was put out. But his ideas were still there. So when Marcus wanted to go, there were people who followed him and changed, which meant they did not hold to the original faith once for all delivered for the saints. We in the Continuing Church of God also include in our succession list the leaders in Antioch up until the death of Serapion. I'll hold this list up here. You can see people listed up there, starting with Peter, and including people such as Ignatius and Theophilus, who I mentioned before. We have teachings from these people, and they held to Church of God teachings, not Protestant teachings. We don't believe that their successors were particularly faithful, and even though the Greco-Romans do. Interestingly, the Antiochian churches, Eastern Orthodox, claim all those Church of God people as their people, but they don't have the same teachings. Okay? It's one thing how we differ from these other churches who claim apostolic succession who don't really have it. We have those teachings. I should also point out that according to Catholic scholars, when Eusebius was writing about church history, they said he intentionally left out what happened when these churches got taken over, basically. So we can't list certain people because we believe the records were destroyed by Eusebius when he had them. Now, considering apostolic succession, I want to make a few comments. Polycarp is a unique successor. One of the reasons he's a unique successor is unlike many other successors that people have claimed. We have a letter written to Polycarp when he was alive, a letter written from Polycarp when he was alive, and a letter written about Polycarp right after he was killed. So we have a lot of information about him. He grew up in Asia Minor. Polycarp was converted at a pretty young age. He was baptized when he was 18, as was I, by the way. And I'd like to read something that Herbert W. Armstrong wrote about him in the Good News magazine, December 1981. It's significant, after his release, John trained Polycarp, elder of Smyrna, a city near Ephesus in the province of Asia. At neighboring Smyrna, Polycarp presided over the Church of God for half a century after John's death. So he's acknowledging the succession there. Polycarp stood up boldly for the truth while many fell away and began having fellowship with the Catholic bishops of Rome. History relates that following the example of Peter, Paul, and John, Polycarp wrote many letters to congregations and individuals, though all these had perished except one edited version. So we only have one letter left from him, but he did a bunch of them. Now I'd like to read something that was reported about him in the 2nd century by a Greco-Roman saint. Polycarp was not only instructed by the apostles and conversed with many who had seen Christ, but also by the apostles of Asia, appointed bishop of the church of Smyrna. He always taught the things which he'd learned from the apostles, which the church had handed down, which alone are true. To these things all the Asiatic churches testify. So we're talking about the church in Asia Minor, as do those men who have succeeded Polycarp down to the present time. So this was written by Irenaeus about 180 AD. He said that those people were faithful, even though Irenaeus wasn't. There's also a very powerful epistle of Polycarp written to the Philippians, from which those who choose to do so are anxious about their salvation can learn the character of his faith in the preaching of the truth. Polycarp was clearly appointed by the original apostles and taught the original faith, as did his faithful successors in Asia Minor and what we in the Continuing Church of God do today. Now, Polycarp is unique among those claimed to be direct successors of the apostles. And I told you that we've got a letter that he wrote. There's letters written to him, and the letters written about him right after he died. So we've got information about him. He was true apostolic successor. Now, despite Greco-Roman supporters praising Polycarp's faithfulness, they and their Protestant associates don't hold to positions that Polycarp held. And later in this sermon series, I'm going to go through that. But one other thing I think I'd like to cover right now is, it'll take me a couple of minutes here, and that's something I haven't covered before, and that's in any sermon. That's about the British Isles and early beliefs. It should be mentioned that there are legends and or myths that the Apostle Paul and Joseph of Arimathea Apostle Paul, and Joseph of Arimathea made it to the British Isles, something Jesus did as well when he was a child with Joseph of Arimathea. So I want to read a particular claim here. Christianity was first introduced into Britain by Joseph of Arimathea, 36 to 39, followed by Simon Zelotes, the apostle, then by Aristobulus, the first bishop of the Britons, then by St. Paul. Now, this seems possible, but it might be a later legend or myth. People who've written that kind of thing seem to be basing this partially on a writing by a British historian by the name of Gildas, who in 542 AD wrote, "We know certainly that Christ, the true Son, S-U-N, afforded his light, the knowledge of his precepts, to our island in the last year of the reign of Tiberius Caesar." And now if that account was accurate, that would be 36 or 37 AD. Now I want to read a claim by the Anglican George F. Jowett. He's since died, but and the book I found was published in 2009, but he wrote this before this. He said, "The present Mother British Church is the only Christian church that has maintained an unbroken apostolic succession of bishops from the beginning, with all the named Episcopal churches sharing this distinction." Now, that's his claim, but if you read his book, he also mentions that the Druids had crosses and believed in the immortality of the soul prior to Joseph of Arimathea coming to Britain. He suggested that that helped make the conversion to Christianity easy for them. But that's simply not the case. He also claimed that British King Aristobulus was converted by Joseph of Arimathea, and that Britain was a warring Christian nation in his book. Well, early Christians didn't war, so that's legend or falsehood. And of course, early Christians didn't believe in the immortality of the soul, and they didn't use crosses. And he also should be considered that modern Episcopalians condone aspects of sin that no early Christian did. I want to read something that Polycarp wrote. This is chapter 5 of his letter to the Philippians. This is from Polycarp. "Knowing then that God is not mocked, we ought to walk worthy of his commandment and glory. In like manner should the deacons be blameless before the face of his righteousness, as being servants of God in Christ, and not of men. They must not be slanderers, double-tongued, lovers of money, but temperate in all things, compassionate, industrious, walking according to the truth of the Lord, who is a servant of all. If we please him in this present world, we shall receive also the future world, according as he has promised to us that he will raise us again from the dead, if we walk worthily of him. We shall reign with him, provided only we believe. In like manner, like young men, be blameless in all things, being especially careful to preserve purity, and keeping himself in as with a bridle from every form of evil. For it is well that they should be cut off from the lusts that are in the world, since every lust warreth against the Spirit. For neither fornicators, nor effeminate, nor abusers of themselves with mankind, otherwise known as sodomites, shall inherit the kingdom of God, nor those who do things inconsistent and unbecoming." Well, many modern Episcopalians, Anglicans, and Methodists don't agree with Polycarp on several parts of this. So obviously they do not have unbroken succession. Now, regarding this guy by the name of Aristobulus, sometimes called Aristobule in English, he was allegedly one of the 7 that Jesus sent out in Luke 10, verse 17. And it's been claimed by Roman Catholic sources, such as Hippolytus, that he was one of the 70. The Eastern Orthodox claim that he was the brother of the Apostle Barnabas, and he was the person mentioned in Romans 16, verse 10. Now, maybe that happened, we don't know. But assuming that Paul or Joseph of Arimathea or Aristobulus came to Britain, it would be logical to conclude that they would hold to Church of God, not Protestant doctrines. And several reports actually support this conclusion. And Episcopalians don't hold to what I'm about to do, nor the Anglicans. Okay, some of the Celts had foot washing, and that's not a practice among them. And they had an Arian or semi-Arian view of the Godhead, which means they did not hold to a Trinitarian view of the Godhead. Some of them, they avoided unclean meats. They also forbade sexual intercourse during menstruation, consistent with Leviticus 18:17 and Ezekiel 36, verse 17. They did not observe Easter Sunday, yet they kept the 14th. Now those are Church of God doctrines, not Protestant positions. They did hold some Protestant positions. They were opposed to the type of confession the Catholics did and the worship of saints and purgatory and some stuff about the 7 sacraments. Actually, when the Roman Catholic priest and monk Augustine arrived in Britain around 597, he was shocked and disappointed to find out that the people there didn't like Greco-Roman practices. They didn't want to switch Passover to Sunday and all this kind of stuff. But in time, many in the British Isles changed. I want to read a report from regarding this. This is talking about from the Church Chronicle. The Celtic Church, which occupied Ireland, Scotland, and Britain, had the Syriac Byzantine scriptures instead of the Latin Vulgate of Rome. The Celtic Church, with the Waldenses and the Eastern Empire, kept the seventh-day Sabbath. Now I'm going to read something from a book called The Messianic Legacy, Secret Brotherhoods, written by M. Bagiant. This was published in 2004. In its organization, the Celtic Church circumvented the Church of Rome and functioned as a repository of elements of Nazarene tradition, transmitted from Egypt, Syria, and Asia Minor. Now let me stop right here. Nazarene tradition would have included practices that the Protestants don't accept, such as the Sabbath and the holy days, which Protestants continue to be undated. Continuing, this author writes, in 664, the Synod of Whitby effectively dissolved the Celtic Church and Ireland was brought into the Roman fold. So by 664, they pretty much had gotten rid of people who held Church of God doctrines. Now, perhaps it should be pointed out in the late 1600s, Thomas Bampfield, who had been the Speaker of the House of Parliament for one time under Cromwell, mentioned Sabbatarian continuity in British Isles. He contended that the seventh day had been kept in England in unbroken succession until the 13th century. But I did some more research and found that a few of the Lollards in the British Isles, people that were called Lollards, but not ones who really followed Wycliffe, continued to keep the Sabbath from the 13th to 17th centuries. And then from then on, we also have proof that it was kept. But the Church of England, the official Church of England, never kept the Sabbath, so they don't have succession. So to kind of summarize some of this, Protestants either claim they have apostolic succession via Rome, perpetual existence, or just a movement that developed in the last 5 centuries or so. And Baptists who've looked into the perpetuity part can find out that, look, it's not possible. Novation was not a faithful Christian. The faithful Paulicians held Church of God doctrines. The faithful Cathari and Waldenses held Church of God doctrines. And they were in conflict with the Baptists. And furthermore, the Anabaptists, which they find certain that they were their people, held important positions that are contrary to those held by the modern Baptists. They don't have that type of succession. The continuing Church of God asserts that we do have succession to laying on the hands from the time of the original apostles to our members today. We believe that we hold the original faith and can prove it and demonstrate it here in that particular book, as well as this other one that I mentioned before about Hope of Salvation, available at the CCOG.org website. And in general, you can find writings from people that the Greco-Roman Protestants considered to be saints who held Church of God positions. We assert that if you know who the faithful leaders were in the first couple of centuries, that you have a better idea of finding the origins of the true church, knowing who the true church is today. And we have a book on also, where's the true church, Christian church today? Because a lot of people don't know. They've heard things, they've heard claims, they've heard Roman claims, they've heard Baptist claims, they've heard some Protestant claims that simply are not the case. The reality is, if you are interested in the truth, if you're interested in being faithful, I urge you to believe what the Bible says and look at the books and booklets that I've been holding up to give you a way to be like the Bereans of old, so you can search the Scriptures daily to see if this is so. Because the reality is, the true continuity, the true original faith, was held by people who have Continuing Church of God believes to this day. And you can prove that if you're willing to prove all things and hold fast to that which is good, as the Apostle Paul admonished Christians to do. This is Dr. Bob Thiel for the Continuing Church of God.